In the first race of the 2022 season, Kevin Magnussen crossed the finish line in 5th place to score Haas's first points in over a year. K-Mag then went on to score in the Saudi Arabian and Emilia-Romagna Grand Prix as well, and so after the first 4 races of the season, I really thought that Haas were back. But sadly for all the Haas fans out there, the season's been pretty downhill since then. They've spent more money on fixing Mick Schumacher's car than Red Bull spent on catering, and so I think they haven't been able to actually improve it as much. But we'll get on to that later. In the meantime, let's talk about what's happened to Haas. It feels like ages ago, but do you remember when Haas's livery looked like this? That was in February this year, but honestly I forgot it even happened before I started making this video. At first they were set to have Nikita Mazepin and Mick Schumacher driving the car, and so it was set to be another damage-filled year. Which, as I've mentioned, it still was, but maybe less so than if we had big bad Nikita in the car. So why didn't we have Nikita Mazepin in the car? Well, I'm sure all of you know about the Russian invasion of Ukraine by now, but if you're watching this video from the future, then Russia invaded Ukraine. But the reason Mazepin wasn't in the car wasn't just as simple as Haas saying no. Mazepin was never in the car because of his talent behind the wheel, because to be brutally honest, he had none. But Haas were in a sticky situation with money, so they needed a bit of cash from Mazepin's dad. But Dmitry Mazepin wasn't just going to give him loads of money without getting something back, so in return Haas were going to be sponsored by his company Uralkali. I'm not 100% sure on what the company makes, but I think it's something to do with fertilizer. Anyway, what the company sold wasn't the reason Mazepin was dropped. It was because their colours were the Russian flag, and as a result Haas had to show the Russian flag on their car, like everywhere. And when Russia was currently dropping bombs on an innocent country, the Russian flag was a bit of a touchy subject. So they rocked up to the last day of preseason testing with just a plain white livery, and shortly after that they announced that they wouldn't be sponsored by Uralkali this year, and as a result Nikita Mazepin would be dropped as well. But while Haas lost a sponsor, I've gained one. That's right, this video is sponsored by Atlas VPN. I've worked with Atlas VPN in the past, and since then I've pretty much used them every day. I have the app installed on all my devices, and the fact there's no limit to how many devices I can protect is one of the best things about Atlas VPN in my opinion. I do a lot of my YouTube work from school, and the fact I can use the VPN to bypass the restrictions on the school Wi-Fi is incredibly useful. And I'm not ashamed to admit I use some dodgy websites to download the footage I use for my videos, and trust me, the fact that Atlas VPN blocks those "Stacy is 5 miles away" pop-ups has saved me from a lot of embarrassment from other students, as well as making the whole video making process a lot faster. But Atlas VPN isn't just for bypassing Wi-Fi restrictions in your school. You can use it to watch Netflix shows that aren't available in your country and keep your internet searches private. I'll leave the benefits of that last point to your imagination. Right now, Atlas VPN are running a Black Friday deal, with Atlas VPN Premium being just $1.70 a month, with 6 months free on top of that when you use my link. Plus, you'll get a 30-day money-back guarantee. This is their best deal of the year, so there really is no reason not to try it out. I promise you won't be disappointed. Obviously, Mazepin's departure left an open seat for Haas, but I think the person who replaced Mazepin is part of the reason they looked so good at the start of the year. See, Kevin Magnussen has always been a really solid driver. Maybe he isn't world championship material, but you don't have to be when you come into F1, as long as you're good enough. And on his debut for McLaren in 2014, K-Mag scored a podium, which is something only 17 drivers have achieved, and Kevin is the most recent to do it. What I'm saying here is that Haas went from starting preseason testing with 2 drivers who hadn't scored a point in F1 to starting the race in Bahrain with just 1 driver who hadn't scored a point in F1. I'll get on to Mick Schumacher's struggles in a bit, but first of all let's talk about the first race. I don't think I was alone in assuming Haas were going to have a much better season this year than they did last year, because Haas were the first to stop developing their 2021 car in favour of 2022. In fact, they took it so far that they didn't develop their 2021 car at all. Now, I don't think that I was alone in thinking they wouldn't come out of the blocks as a top team, because ultimately Haas's budget isn't as high as the cost cap goes. And not only that, they employ only about 200 or so people, while Mercedes employ nearly 1,000. So of course they weren't going to be the best of the best this year, but I was sort of expecting a season like they had in 2018. Best of the rest, if you want to call it that. And to be fair, Bahrain very much lived up to that name, with only the top 3 teams finishing ahead of them in qualifying, and after Red Bull's double DNF, only Ferrari and Mercedes finishing the race ahead of them. Well, I say them, I actually mean Kevin Magnussen. See, while K-Mag levelled Haas's best ever result on his return to F1, Mick Schumacher had a much less exciting race. He was half a second slower than his teammate in Q2, meaning he was knocked out in 12th, while Kevin went on to qualify 7th. Then, in the race, Mick only managed 11th, despite 3 cars DNFing ahead of him. So we can look at this race in 2 ways. Either the car was a solid midfielder and K-Mag drove a great race, or Haas were the 4th best team that day and Mick was struggling. And I'm going to assume it's the latter, but I don't mean that to be anti-Mick Schumacher in any way. Haas's 2021 car was so bad that Mick might as well have stayed in F2, and so when they actually had a competitive car and he was under genuine pressure to beat a competent teammate, of course he's going to find it more difficult. I'm treating this in a way like his first season in F1, with last year being sort of a taster. So with the amazing result of the first race behind them, Haas set off for Saudi Arabia, where again it would be be sort of mixed. On the K-Mag side of the garage, he qualified 10th and finished 9th, a solid result to round out the opening doubleheader. However, for Mick, he crashed in qualifying, and as a result he had to miss the race on medical grounds. And to be fair, even if he was 100% fit and well, the car wasn't exactly in tip-top condition, and I don't really think they would have been able to put it back together in time for the race start. See, when I say he crashed in qualifying, what I actually mean is he tore the car in half on a concrete wall as if it were made of cardboard and Pritt stick. So anyway, that's the opening 2 rounds talked about, and Haas left these two with a total of 12 points, which was already quadruple the amount they scored in the last 2 years combined. Now, things took a bit of a slump after the opener, with a double non-score in Australia, but in Imola Kevin scored some more points for the team with 8th in the sprint and 9th in the actual race. But here is where things started to get a bit more rocky. In Miami, Mick Schumacher finished 15th and Magnussen DNF'd after a crash with Lance Stroll at the end of the race. Both drivers were actually on course for points in the race, but both crashed out in incidents that were their own fault. Mick tried a silly dive on Sebastian Vettel which took Seb out of the race and snapped Mick's front wing off, and then Magnussen crashed with Stroll in an incident that wasn't shown on TV. Haas were actually on for 7th and 8th in Spain, but with Magnussen getting a puncture after being crashed into by Hamilton at the start, and Mick Schumacher suffering from bad pace and bad strategy, the team's 8-10 qualifying turned into a 14-17 finish. Then came Monaco, where Haas had a double retirement. Now, the team didn't have the chance to really get any points this race anyway, as they'd qualified 13th and 15th in the hardest track to overtake out of the calendar. Magnussen was the first of the two to retire with a water pressure issue on lap 20, and then Mick Schumacher followed it up on lap 25 with another massive crash. Once again, he snapped the whole car in half and probably again cost the team $1 million in damages. For a team who already have a much lower budget than the other teams, having to spend millions of dollars on repairing the car is always going to be a bit of an issue when you want to spend money on other things like development or hiring new staff. In Baku, both drivers were knocked out in Q1, with Mick last by over half a second. In the race, Magnussen joined the list of 4 Ferrari engine cars to blow up in the first 20 laps, while Mick Schumacher finished only ahead of Nick Latifi, a lap down. In Canada, it was Mick's turn to DNF with his engine dying while he had a chance at points, while Kevin Magnussen again had a crash with Lewis Hamilton, which, after the FIA allowed themselves to be talked into giving him a black and orange flag, meant he came home last of the finishes. However, after this run of bad results, things seemed to suddenly get better. Mick's run of bottling points or having points bottled finally came to an end in Britain, where he finished 8th, and Magnussen made it double points by coming home in 10th. In the following race, it was the same story, with Mick 6th and Kevin 8th, however, these would be Haas's last points until Austin, and probably could have been their last points of the season given how things have been going. Although, I hope I jinx things like I usually do. So, let's talk about this downturn, shall we? I'll get through it quickly so as not to make the Haas fans sad and so we can actually talk about why it's happened. France was a retirement for Magnussen after being killed by Latifi, and 15th for Mick Schumacher. Neither driver has retired from any of the races since, but with the best result in the US of 8th for Kevin Magnussen, it's obviously not been the best 8 races. In fact, I'd go so far as to say Haas have been the second slowest team at many of these races. So, how did Haas go from best of the rest to the second worst team in less than half a season? Well, to put it simply, it's just that they can't develop as fast as the teams with bigger budgets. But by sacrificing last year, it meant they got a significant head start. So of course, when all the other teams didn't get that head start, Haas would be doing a lot better than maybe where they should be. See, Haas could be employing the best engineers in the world, but they aren't employing enough of them. That's not Gunter Steiner's fault, or Gene Haas's fault, or anyone's fault. They just don't have as much money as a top team does, and so they can't afford to hire as many people. And as well as maybe not being able to afford the best staff, Haas may not have the best equipment in their factories. Maybe their wind tunnel isn't as good as Red Bull's, or maybe they have older, slower equipment, which means their development takes longer overall. Whether it's down to equipment or lack of staff or both, Haas would never have been able to develop at the rate a team like McLaren or Alpine have this season, so obviously they were going to drop back to them at some point. And if my theory is correct, then it looks like Haas are going to be having a good few years in the future, as they've just signed MoneyGram as a title sponsor, which will provide them with enough money to reach the budget cap and therefore put them on a level playing field with everyone else. And even better, MoneyGram don't want to put the worst F2 driver they could find in the car next year. But if you have another theory or just want to let me know what you think of mine, then leave a comment below. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.